The courtroom was heavy with tension, the kind that hangs in the air like a storm about to break. Reporters filled the benches, cameras lined the walls, and whispers moved like an invisible current between those waiting for the spectacle to unfold. In the center of it all sat a young man, barely 20, his eyes fixed on the wooden table before him. His suit was immaculate, but his hands trembled ever so slightly as he gripped the edge of the seat. He was the millionaire who had once been the symbol of promise, of innovation, of youth and success. But now he was the target of scorn and suspicion. The world that had once admired him now wanted him ruined. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued man with an expensive suit and even more expensive arrogance, stood beside him, flipping through papers. The accusations were severe fraud, manipulation, even conspiracy. The evidence, though questionable, was painted to look damning. The courtroom was filled with people who had already made up their minds, convinced that wealth equaled guilt. Every flash from a camera felt like a dagger, every whispered word another wound. Yet behind the polished arrogance of the legal team, behind the well-dressed spectators and cold stares, sat a small figure, an 8-year-old girl, her clothes faded and her shoes too big, watching everything unfold with eyes that saw deeper than most adults ever could. The trial had dragged on for weeks, and hope had started to fade from the young man's face. Every argument was twisted, every attempt to prove his innocence drowned in the noise of influence and manipulation. His lawyer had promised victory but now seemed disinterested, his tone increasingly cold, his confidence thinning. Then came the day when everything broke. The prosecution delivered one more blow, accusing the young millionaire of lying about evidence, and the defense lawyer, his last supposed ally, stood aside and muttered, "I can't defend him anymore." The words echoed like a verdict long before the judge could even speak. He gathered his documents, shook his head, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving his client staring blankly ahead, completely abandoned. The silence that followed was suffocating. Reporters leaned forward, eager for a quote, a tear, a sign of collapse. The judge looked confused. Even the jury exchanged uncertain glances. And then, breaking that silence, came a small voice from the back of the courtroom. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that drew every pair of eyes toward it. "I can defend him." The words came from the little girl, standing on the bench, her small hands clenched at her sides, her chin lifted with trembling determination. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. People turned to see who had spoken, expecting a joke or mockery, but there she stood, poor, barefoot, and defiant, her eyes fixed on the young man at the center of it all. Whispers erupted instantly. "Who is she? Is this a prank? Security?" But before anyone could act, the girl stepped forward, walking past rows of shocked faces. The judge watched in disbelief, but curiosity overpowered authority. "Young lady," he began, "you can't be here." But she didn't stop. She walked right up to the defense table, her gaze never leaving the man who had been left to drown in a sea of accusation. "You don't know me," she said softly, her voice quivering yet strong, "but I know him. He saved my mother's life." Gasps filled the room. The judge leaned forward. The prosecution frowned, and the young millionaire's eyes widened as memories flickered across his face. Months earlier, before the scandal, the man had donated money to a small hospital struggling to survive. It wasn't for publicity. It wasn't part of his business. He had seen a news story about a mother denied treatment because she couldn't afford it, and quietly paid her bills. That mother was this girl's parent. He didn't even tell anyone, she said, her voice breaking slightly. He didn't want thanks or fame, he just wanted to help. And now you all think he's bad because you don't know the truth? The girl's words carried no legal weight, no evidence or paperwork, but they pierced through the cynicism in that room like sunlight breaking through a storm. The prosecution laughed uneasily, trying to dismiss her as a distraction, but something had shifted. The audience, the jury, even the judge, everyone, had seen the sincerity in her eyes. "You can't speak here," the prosecutor said sharply. "You're just a child." But she turned to him and said, "Maybe, but at least I'm not lying." The courtroom froze again. The prosecutor's face darkened, and he looked to the judge for help, but the judge remained silent, watching with a look of unexpected reflection. The girl walked to the young man and placed her small hand on his arm. "You didn't do those things," she said quietly. "You told the truth, and I believe you. I'll say it even if nobody else does." In that instant, the tension cracked. The audience felt something real, something raw, in a room that had long been ruled by manipulation. The cameras that had once sought scandal now captured a moment of humanity. The young millionaire, who had sat hollow and defeated, suddenly lifted his head. For the first time in months, his eyes filled not with fear, but gratitude. He whispered, "Thank you," and it was enough to make even the coldest hearts in the room falter. The girl's courage had done what all his money couldn't. It reminded them that truth doesn't need wealth, only conviction. The guards stepped forward, unsure whether to escort her out or let her finish. The judge raised his hand and told them to wait. He asked the girl gently, "Do you understand what it means to defend someone?" She nodded earnestly. "It means standing with them when everyone else runs away." Her words fell heavy in the silence that followed. The judge leaned back, visibly moved, and for the first time since the trial began, the tone of the room shifted from hostility to hesitation. Even the jury members, who had looked ready to convict, now exchanged uncertain looks. In that single, unexpected act of defiance, the 8-year-old girl had changed everything. The courtroom that had been ruled by lies and fear now stood still before the power of innocence and gratitude. She was poor, small, and unheard, but her voice had reached where authority, law, and influence could not. She stood beside the broken man, not with evidence, but with truth. And in that moment, the world saw what justice was supposed to look like. The silence that followed her declaration felt almost sacred, as if the walls of the courtroom themselves had stopped breathing. The little girl stood there, trembling but unyielding, her chin lifted high despite the stares drilling into her from every direction. The prosecution tried to laugh it off at first, a few smug smiles flickering across their faces, but it was forced, nervous. There was something in her tone, something so honest, so raw that it shook the very air. She was not speaking from power, nor from law, but from the truth buried beneath the noise. A truth everyone had been too blind or too afraid to see. The child had no legal background, no credentials, no authority. But she had something that all the adults in that room had long traded away for money. Pride or reputation. She had purity of heart. The judge, who had spent decades presiding over lies and theatrics, found himself lost for words. The courtroom had been a stage for manipulation, for lawyers who twisted truth into performance, but now the script had been broken by a single child who dared to speak out of turn. Her voice, though small, carried through the room with an intensity that silenced even the sound of camera shutters. "You're all wrong about him," she said again, her hands clenched at her sides. "You think money makes someone bad, but you're the ones who only see it that way because you never had any." The words struck a chord that none could ignore. The prosecutor's smirk faltered. He had built his case not on solid evidence, but on the assumption that the audience already hated the young man. It was easy to make the rich seem guilty, easier still when the world already despised success. But now, a poor child, the very image of innocence and humility, was standing on the opposite side, not as his accuser, but as his defender. It confused the narrative he had so carefully built. The reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, unsure whether to keep filming or simply watch. Something real was happening, something human. The little girl began to speak again, her voice steadier now, her eyes darting toward the jury. "You all see his clothes, his car, the money you think he has, and you think that makes him bad. But I saw him when no one was watching. I saw him when he came to the hospital where my mom was dying. He didn't come with cameras. He didn't come to make himself look good. He came because he cared." A murmur spread through the crowd. The young millionaire, who had been sitting motionless beside her, lowered his head, his throat tightening. He hadn't expected her to remember him, let alone stand for him in this impossible moment. She told the story in fragments, her small hands moving as she spoke. Her mother had been turned away from treatment because they couldn't pay. The hospital had demanded money they didn't have. Days passed, and the hope of survival began to fade. Then one morning, the doctors changed their tone, the nurses started smiling, and her mother was suddenly being treated. The little girl had later learned it was this same man. This man now accused of being a liar and a thief who had quietly paid the bills. He never gave his name, never took credit. It was only by accident that she had discovered it was him. The prosecutor tried to object, claiming the story was irrelevant, but the judge raised his hand and said quietly, "Let her speak." The authority in his voice silenced the room again. The girl turned back to the jury, her voice trembling but clear. "You think he's bad because the news says so? But I saw what he did when nobody was watching. I saw his heart. He didn't ask for anything back. And now, you all sit here judging him for things he didn't even do." Her eyes glistened with tears that refused to fall. The innocence in her words tore through the courtroom's walls of pretense. The jury members looked uneasy. Some leaned forward, others looked down at their notes, suddenly unsure of what they were supposed to believe anymore. For weeks they had been fed cold arguments and manipulated evidence. But now they were being confronted with something that could not be quantified or dismissed: human goodness. The young millionaire's face softened, the exhaustion lifting slightly as he listened to the little girl's voice rise again. "You adults make everything so complicated. You talk about rules and lies and money, but you forget what's right and what's wrong. You forget that sometimes good people get trapped by bad ones who know how to play your games better." The courtroom shifted. For the first time since the trial began, the atmosphere was no longer hostile. It was thoughtful. Even the journalists, who had come for headlines, started writing slower, the click of keyboards fading. The girl's words were simple, but they cut through the layers of deceit that had smothered the case. She wasn't just defending the man, she was defending the idea that goodness still mattered in a world that had become numb to it. The prosecutor finally spoke again, his voice strained. "That may all be very touching, but feelings don't prove innocence." The girl looked at him calmly. "No," she said softly, "but lies don't prove guilt either." The courtroom erupted in murmurs once more. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but his expression betrayed him. He was moved. The little girl turned back toward the young man, who was staring at her in disbelief. For weeks he had been surrounded by people who were paid to care, and yet this child, who owed him nothing, had done more to stand for him than anyone else. He whispered her name under his breath. Realizing who she was, the daughter of the woman he'd helped months ago, he had forgotten about the donation entirely, never expecting anything in return. And now, fate had brought her here, standing between him and ruin. The sight broke something open inside him. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't hide them. She had reminded him that not everyone in the world was cruel, that not every battle was lost. The judge finally spoke again, his tone softer than before. "You've said a lot today, young lady, more than most adults manage to say in a lifetime." His words carried an undertone of awe. He looked at the prosecutor, then at the defense table, and sighed deeply. Sometimes truth doesn't need credentials. Sometimes it needs courage. He didn't look at her when he said it, but everyone knew it was meant for her. The little girl didn't smile. She didn't seem proud or triumphant. She simply nodded and took a small step closer to the man she was defending. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, the poorest person in the room standing beside the richest, the smallest standing beside the one who had been brought to his knees. It was a moment that transcended logic, something even the cameras couldn't fully capture. She wasn't defending him with laws or arguments. She was defending him with truth, with humanity, with the pure belief that good should not be punished simply because it wears the wrong face. And for a fleeting moment, even the walls of that courtroom seemed to understand. The air inside the courtroom felt different now, heavier but alive. Charged with something that went beyond fear or outrage, it was awareness. The people who had come to witness a downfall were now witnessing something else entirely, something rare and unsettling. The little girl had not only defended the young man, she had peeled back the layers of deception that everyone else had accepted as truth. Her small voice had done what money, law, and influence could not. It forced everyone in that room to confront their own reflection. The prosecutors, the journalists, the jurors, even the spectators, all of them felt a strange discomfort that came not from guilt, but from the reminder of how easily they had chosen convenience over conscience. The judge, who had long mastered the art of neutrality, found his composure slipping. He watched the child and felt something deep inside stir, a flicker of emotion he hadn't allowed himself in years. He had seen hundreds of cases, criminals pretending to be victims, victims turned into villains, truth buried beneath theatrics, but this moment felt different. It was raw and unscripted, a confrontation between innocence and the machinery of corruption. The young millionaire sat still, hands folded, as though afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile truth that had just been spoken into existence. The prosecutor, desperate to regain control, cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rising, "this is completely irregular. We cannot let a child disrupt due process with emotional manipulation. This is a courtroom, not a stage for pity." His words were sharp, but his confidence had already cracked. The jury wasn't nodding anymore. The reporters weren't smiling at his rhetoric. They had seen something he couldn't erase, a sincerity untouched by strategy. The girl turned her eyes toward him, and though she said nothing, the silence that followed her stare was more powerful than any argument he could make. Then, in a trembling voice, she asked, "If the truth comes from someone small, does that make it less true?" The prosecutor froze. The judge's gavel didn't strike. The audience didn't whisper. Every sound seemed to vanish as the question echoed in their minds. It was so simple, so painfully logical, and yet it dismantled the entire pretense of authority that ruled the room. The little girl wasn't attacking the system. She was exposing its hypocrisy. The truth should have been enough, but somewhere along the way, truth had been replaced by whoever could afford to speak at the loudest. The young man beside her finally raised his head. His voice, hoarse and fragile, broke through the quiet. "You shouldn't have to do this," he said softly, looking at the girl with tears brimming in his eyes. "This isn't your fight." But she shook her head. "It's everyone's fight when the world starts punishing people for doing what's right." Her words cut through the air like a blade, sharp enough to silence even the skeptics. There was something in the way she said it, not with arrogance, but with heartbreaking clarity. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to remind them what justice was supposed to mean. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench. He had seen lawyers perform miracles of persuasion, watched witnesses twist truth into poetry. But this child had done something neither power nor experience could replicate. She made everyone remember their humanity. The defense's empty chair sat as a silent monument to cowardice, a reminder that the man who should have stood there had fled when things became inconvenient. But in his place stood a child who didn't even reach the height of the table, standing with a courage that made men decades older seem small. Slowly, a few members of the jury began to look at the young millionaire differently. Doubt had given way to reflection. They began to question not only the evidence but the motives behind it. Was this man truly guilty, or was he just an easy target for those who thrived on public outrage? The girl's story had done more than defend him. It had revealed a deeper rot beneath the Kaisa system that had become addicted to spectacle, where justice was no longer about truth but about perception. The prosecutor tried again, his tone desperate now. "She's a child. She doesn't understand how the world works." But that was his mistakes. She understood it too well. "Maybe I don't," she said, her eyes shining, "but maybe that's why I still believe it can be better." The words struck with a force that made even the judge look away. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, papers trembling slightly in his hand. His certainty was gone. He could feel the tide turning against him, not because of evidence, but because of morality, a concept he hadn't had to face in a long time. The young man looked at the girl again, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. How could he thank someone for something like this? How could he tell her that her courage had restored a part of him he thought he had lost forever? The cameras clicked again, but this time not to capture scandal, they captured redemption. For once, the lens wasn't feeding on ruin. It was recording something pure. The judge finally broke the silence, his voice low but firm. Enough, he said, not in anger but in reflection. This trial was meant to uncover the truth. Perhaps it has. He didn't elaborate, didn't scold the girl, didn't call for her removal. Instead, he turned to the jury, his eyes lingering on each face, as if reminding them that their duty went beyond procedure. What you decide today will speak not only for the law, but for the kind of world you want to live in. The girl stepped back, her small frame trembling from exhaustion, but she stood tall. She had done what no one expected. She hadn't used fancy words or evidence or logic. She had simply told the truth. And in doing so, she had shown that the foundation of justice wasn't authority, it was integrity. The people who had mocked her at first now looked at her with awe. Even the bailiff, who had been ready to escort her out, stood frozen, unsure whether to salute her bravery or shield her from the cruelty of the world outside. The young millionaire looked at her one last time, his voice barely audible. You saved me? She shook her head gently. No, she whispered. I reminded them. He understood then what she meant. She hadn't fought for him as a person, but for the truth that everyone else had abandoned. Her defiance wasn't rebellion. It was restoration outside the courthouse. A storm was breaking, rain starting to fall against the windows. Inside, something else was breaking too, the illusion that justice belonged only to the powerful. The jurors exchanged glances, heavy with thought. The judge removed his glasses and wiped his eyes discreetly, and the prosecutor sat down, defeated not by law, but by truth. The little girl stood in the center of it all, silent now, her presence speaking louder than any closing argument ever could. She had come from nothing, yet her words had stripped the false power from those who pretended to own justice. She had no title, no authority, no training, but she had done the one thing no one else dared to do. She had spoken when silence was easier. She had stood when others turned away, and she had defended not just a man, but the very idea that rights still mattered in a world that had forgotten what that meant.